Welcome back. Before we get into this chapter, I would like to show you a video.
Singapore is a tiny country, so tiny you can drive across the island in just an hour. Despite its size and lack of natural resources, Singapore's 5.6 million people enjoy one of the highest average incomes in the world, ahead of countries like Germany, France, and Japan. So, how did this little island get so rich? Singapore doesn't have resources like coal or oil, but it does have something countries can't buy: location. The island sits in the middle of an important trade route, connecting Asia to Europe. That's a key reason why the British decided, back in 1819, to set up a colony in Singapore. Location isn't everything, though. There are several countries nearby that could have made use of their whereabouts, but they weren't quite as successful. That's because there are other ingredients that go into this crazy rich Singapore recipe. I'm at the Raffles Hotel, which is one of the most prominent icons of Singapore's colonial history. Unlike some of its neighbors, which wanted to separate themselves from their colonial histories, Singapore kept close ties with Britain, even after independence in 1965. That decision announced to the rest of the world that Singapore was open for business. That's important because we know now that exports help to grow and expand an economy. But back then, it wasn't conventional wisdom. Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea became known as the four Asian tigers, which have grown rapidly since the 1960s. Their rise was fueled by exports, industrialization, and more crucially, big doses of government intervention. This was especially true for Singapore.
How do you think about the video? Let's use this video as an example to get into today's chapter.
After watching the CNBC documentary on Singapore, what's in your mind? Many of you may wonder why and how a tiny Singapore can become the one of richest countries so far in the world. Before you answer this question, you need to know the economic development of a country like Singapore and the factors affecting a nation's economic development. For this chapter, we have to define what is economic development, which factors affect a nation's economic development, and the national difference in economic development. First of all, there are two measures defining economic development. One measure is gross national income, aka GNI, which measures the total annual income received by residents of a nation. To standardize GNI across country, we often use the nation population as a weighting ratio. In other words, you can use GNI per person to compare the economic development between different countries. Another measure is gross domestic product, aka GDP, which calculates the market value of all the financial goods and services produced by a nation. Similarly, you can use GDP per person to compare the economic development between different countries. In addition, GDP is consisting of 5 major sectors, including consumption, investment, government expenditure, exports, and imports. The equation of GDP can be written as GDP equals to consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus exports minus imports. However, there are some critiques of these traditional measures because they do not take into account the cost of living, purchasing power, brand market, and human development. Take Singapore for example. Since 1960s, The economic development of Singapore is based on the investment of foreign multinational business in Singapore, the increase in exports, and the government intervention and expenditure. The GDP of Singapore increased from 0.7 billion in 1960 to 323 billion in 2017. At the national level, the major factors affecting the economic development are political economy, geography, education, and culture. We only focus on political economy, geography, and education for this chapter, and we'll discuss culture in the chapter 4. If you can recall from the chapter 2, political economy has three major building blocks, including political economy and legal systems. There are two main streams of political economies affecting economic development and progress. The first one is neoclassical school, arguing that the increase in investment and government expenditure can boost the economic progress. This school is more likely relying on government and command economies, and more like a collectivism. The second one, innovation school, arguing that innovation and entrepreneurship are the driver leading to economic progress. By definition, innovation includes new products, new process, new organization, new management practices, and new strategies. Entrepreneurship is the spirit of commercializing innovative new products and processes. This school is more likely relying on market economies and individualism, and requires strong protection of property rights on innovation. There are strong relationships among economic progress, economic freedom, and democratic regimes. Use Singapore as an example. Singapore was a right-wing totalitarianism country back to 1960s. Since then, the economic progress came with the economic freedom, which allow multinational business to do business almost freely, and which protects the property rights. Now, Singapore is the second best country to do business in the world. Moreover, Singapore also transforms itself from a totalitarian to a democratic country. Other examples include South Korea and Indonesia in 1980s and the 90s. Geography is one of factors affecting economic growth. Countries with favorable geography are more likely to engage in trade, more open to market-based economic system, and promote the economic growth. By definition, favorable geography includes appropriate location and temperature. For example, Singapore has a good location between Europe and Asia. The opposite example is Africa. Most of the poor African nations are landlocked countries. Education is another factor affecting economic growth. For one thing, countries that invest in education have higher growth rate because the workforce is more productive. For example, China and India have invested in education and having a very cheaper and skilled worker with college degrees. For another thing, countries that invest in education have strong economic progress because the workforce is more innovative. For example, USA, Japan, and Singapore all have great university and good performers of innovation. The national difference in economic development can be found either in the economic progress or political economy. You can see the spread of market-based systems across the world, such as the crash of Soviet Union and the change in China, Vietnam, and other communist countries. There are more deregulation of economic system, international trade, and law systems. There are more transformation from state-owned business to private-owned business. However, there are some paradoxes. Some people, like Fukuyama, say the world is becoming homogeneous and more democratic. Other people, like Huntington, say the world is becoming divergent and more complex because the rich gets richer while the poor gets poorer. The massive violence, protests, terrorism, and the country risks are rising. After reading this chapter, you may think how exactly economic development and political economy affect the multinational business in a certain country. There are three dimensions: benefits, cost, and risk. You have to take into account all these dimensions. For example, you have to figure out the benefits such as economic growth, geographic location, and education. You also have to weigh in the costs such as legal costs and country infrastructure. Finally, you have to consider the potential risk from the political economy and the real legal system. Remember that video of Venezuela from chapter 2 and Singapore from this chapter. They are telling the stories about the political economy and economic development just from the different angles. Other things being equal, the benefit cost risk trade-off is likely to be most valuable in politically stable, developed and developing nations that have free market system and no dramatic upsurge in either inflation rates or private sector debts.
Alright, that's all for this chapter. If you have any question, write me an email. I will see you next section.